troops who came as military support were strict fundamentalists with a fearsome fighting reputation. They were called the Almoravids. The Almoravids were a tribe of nomads from the Sahara. They had black skin and wore veils that covered everything apart from their eyes. When they went into battle, they rode light-footed, versatile little horses and took with them camels and elephants. But they were fiercest of all when it came to religion. They preached a return to basic Muslim values, and when they came to Al-Andalus, they were shocked by what they found.
There are people from the desert. There is people newborn to the religion, so they have a hard feeling of it.
Evangelical Islam?
Yeah, absolutely. Not accustomed to civilization.
Yeah. What did they think had gone wrong with Islam here?
They felt they have to purify things. They said, this is people very accustomed to civilization, to science. They're talking with Christians, with Jews. This is a mix that we don't like it. We want purified people.
With the barbaric Christian raiders on one side and these new fundamentalist Muslims on the other, Al-Andalus was crushed. It descended into corruption. A Christian king would provide military aid to a weak Muslim king in return for a substantial payment of gold coin. The whole of Al-Andalus was subjected to this system of extortion. The trouble is, modern Spain chooses to remember this war rather differently. La Reconquista, the reconquest, is presented as a valiant crusade in which Spain is returned to its rightful Christian owners. This pantomime version of history is personified in many of Spain's national heroes, the greatest of whom is a knight called Guzman el Bueno. Every town in Spain has a street named after Guzman el Bueno. He's one of the country's best-loved historical figures. The story of when Guzman defended the town of Tarifa from Muslim raids is well known in Spain. Guzman's descendants, the Medina Sidonia family, became one of the richest landowners in the country. The Duchess of Medina Sidonia has discovered something remarkable about her illustrious ancestor.
Guzman el Bueno is the first of the Guzman family we know about. He is the founder of the family. He came here and lived in this very house. This is the family archive, although it's more than that. It is a rich source of documents from the medieval period and later.
Was it right that one of your ancestors was involved in the Spanish Armada?
The seventh Duke was involved in that campaign. This document dates from 1288. We know my ancestor was in Al-Andalus a year before because he bought a farm. And this document mentions it. It's a permit for him to export 300 bushels of wheat. Look, you can see the word wheat. And what it says is that he is allowed to take this overseas, to where he is from.
So, because of the grammar, you can tell that he comes from overseas, not that he was just visiting from overseas.
Yes, probably it refers to a place which was part of Morocco, much larger then than now, a place where neither wheat nor hay could grow.
The Duchess had discovered that her ancestor, the great Christian knight Guzman el Bueno, was actually a Muslim.
This is really a piece of human history. It dates to 1297. The king refers to Guzman as my vassal because he is a foreigner.
Guzman the vassal?
If it wasn't written here, I wouldn't believe it. It was very common for Muslims to ally themselves with Christian factions, especially when Christians were warring with each other.
It must have been quite a surprise to discover that your ancestor was a Muslim.
Yes, a great surprise. This is because there had been a chronicle which dated back to the 16th century, in which the Guzman family had cleaned up its political and ethnic past. Guzman was said to have been born in León. They didn't just do this with the Guzman family, but with all the families that had doubtful ancestors, ancestors of doubtful race. They cleaned it all up. We have a whole load of documents here from the Spanish Register, and they turn everything we know about Spanish history upside down. The Spanish are simply inventing history. They have turned history into a fable.
The idea that the Christians and the Muslims were fighting a holy war was created in Spain long after the Reconquest actually took place. Even Spain's most famous hero, the swashbuckling El Cid, is caught up in this fantasy. In films and books, El Cid is celebrated as a kind of Christian pin-up, a crusader in the fight against the terrible Moor. But El Cid spent his life, like El Bueno, as a mercenary, fighting for whomsoever would pay him.
The name Cid means the master in Arabic.
So El Cid's an Arabic name?
Yes. In fact, he was the king of Valencia when Valencia was an Islamic city, and he didn't change anything there.
So he had Muslim allies?
That's it. Yeah.
That's not the story you hear, is it?
No, I think the history is much more interesting than the history you hear.
So he was a Christian king, but he didn't force the Muslims that he controlled to convert?
No, he was... In fact, we cannot see the Reconquest as a process of conversion. This is a process of trial and error, of people gaining lands and people gaining prestige.
It's just realpolitik. It's all about getting land.
That's it. We are painting now everything with an religious ideology, but it's not.
So religion's a kind of convenient excuse rather than the driving force?
Absolutely. Religion is always an excuse.
El Cid and Guzman el Bueno weren't simply Christian soldiers fighting a Muslim enemy. If anything, this was a civil war, with both sides desperately scrabbling for land and wealth.
The idea that the Reconquest was something cut and dried, black and white, something that cleaned up society is absurd. I don't know who came up with that idea.
The Spanish historian Palencia, who said that the Reconquista was nothing but a civil war between Spaniards of two different faiths.
Spain is full of dazzling reminders of how the righteous Christians won the country back from the diabolical Moor. The country's most popular saint is called Santiago Matamoros, St. James, the Moor Slayer. But this romanticised version of history distorts the true nature of this conflict. This was not a holy war. Al-Andalus was destroyed in a dirty grab for land, which lasted for over 300 years. And in this conflict, the more refined society was the one least equipped for war. It was the Christians who had little to lose and most to gain. And what happened when the Christians began to take over exposes a curious respect for Muslim culture. When the Christian King Peter took control of Seville in 1248, this is what he had made. It is a beautiful building. It was built for a Christian, and yet in every way it resembles an Islamic palace. On the walls there are inscriptions from the Quran, and above the door there are dedications to its owner, calling him Caliph rather than king.
The conqueror has been conquered by the culture.
It's a tiny bit unexpected that when this Christian king rebuilt this palace, he made it appear so Arabic. It feels as if we're in the Alhambra here.
Well, this palace has many relations with the Alhambra, especially with the Court of Lions. Both builders, King Muhammad V of Granada and King Peter I of Castile, were friends. You have to consider that in Europe, at this time, there was not an architecture of such a splendor comparable to Al-Andalus. And this made a very big attraction for the Christians. And this is why this architecture was used by the Christian to show to the nobility of the kingdom the power, the authority, this room covered with this marvelous dome. It symbolizes a power, because it's the heavens that turns around the king.
But the legacy of Al-Andalus was to affect more than the architecture of Europe. In the midst of this terrible struggle, something incredible was to happen, which would fire the minds of Europeans and expand our intellectual horizons. At the same time that it was being splintered by Christian encroachment, Al-Andalus was at the centre of one of the most influential shifts in thinking that Europe has ever seen. Between the Middle Ages and the modern era, Europe underwent a massive intellectual and cultural revolution. This shift, known as the Renaissance, transformed the human experience. It prompted the exploration of science and the arts and changed the way that men and women saw themselves in relation to God. The Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed were critical stages in the development of Europe. The origins of the Renaissance are generally believed to lie in Italy, where a renewed interest in the classics had a huge impact on art and culture. But the foundations of the Renaissance were laid much earlier, and not in Italy, but in a town called Toledo in Islamic Spain. Toledo was one of Al-Andalus's vulnerable city-states, and in 1085, the Christians seized control of it. Unusually, the handover went very smoothly, and as a result, the Muslims already living in Toledo were allowed to remain as citizens and their mosques were left untouched. The city that emerged accommodated both Muslim and Christian. Spain at this time is a paradox. On one hand, tensions between Muslims and Christians are becoming unbearable, and yet on the other, there is a hugely beneficial intellectual evolution that is only possible because Muslims and Christians are living side by side. When Toledo fell to the Christians, its doors were opened to travellers and intellectuals from all over Europe. These people mixed with the Muslims in the city, learning their language and reading their books. Many of the adventurers came from England. In the late 1100s, an Englishman known as Daniel of Morley travelled to Europe to study. But as his autobiography reveals, he was disgusted with what he found there. I stopped a while in Paris, and there I saw asses rather than men, pretending to be very important. They had desks in front of them, heaving under the weight of 2 or 3 immovable tomes. But because they did not know anything, they were no better than marble statues. I did not want to get infected by a similar petrifaction. But when I heard that the doctrine of the Arabs was in fashion in Toledo, I hurried there as quickly as I could so that I could hear the wisest philosophers in the world. Just as the fall of Alexandria had made a massive body of Greek knowledge available to the Arabs 400 years previously, now the Christian conquest of Toledo passed this storehouse of knowledge on to Europeans, who flocked here in their hundreds. At the backs of shops and in courtyards, groups of men started to gather together, Christians, Muslims and Jews, to work on texts that had been stored in the archives of mosques and churches. These were extraordinary manuscripts, translations of Aristotle and Plato and Euclid, as well as original works by Arabic mathematicians, astronomers and alchemists. This was a resource like no other in the rest of Europe. It was intellectual dynamite.
People came from all over Europe. All these works that were lost in Europe could be found in Toledo. There was lots of wisdom here.
How did the translators work together here in Toledo?
In the first period, there was usually 2 people working together. And then another person who was learned in Latin would write it down in Latin. And that was, I think, the target of working together, and it was very clear. I think it really made it more accurate because it was a teamwork.
How long have these manuscripts been kept in Toledo?
Well, most of the translations were carried out in the 12th and 13th century. That means for almost 900 years, most of them. And here we have the preface in red. That's where we learn about the process of translation. In this case, we read that this book was translated by Gerard of Cremona. It is a medical treatise by Ibn Sina, by Avicenna, and it was translated ab Arabico, from Arabic in Latinum, into Latin, in Toledo.
Yeah. It's a very rich document, isn't it? You get a sense of how valued these things were.
And there is all these little glosses on the right-hand side. People have been adding comments or explaining words that were not clear. Un momento, por favor. Vamos a...
Wow, that's a splendid beast of a thing. Is this looks like it's a work of Aristotle, is it?
Yeah, this is the Rhetorica by Aristotle. Rhetorica Aristotelis.
And here we are, look, here's the man who's working on it. Hermanus Alemanus.
Yeah, Herman the German.
Herman the German.
Yeah, even Germans came all the way to Toledo to find all these texts. And in this case, it is a commentary by Averroes on the text of Aristotle. And both are translated together.
So it's got added value because you've got new Arabic thought coming into the classical text.
Yeah, they are adding, they are supplementing, they are completing what was transmitted from the ancient world.
Knowledge really is power at this time in history, isn't it?
Having a book was something very, very valuable.
Do you find during this process that words slip from one language to another?
Absolutely. Like chemia, that word came into Western languages as chemistry. But we have another word, alchemy, that comes originally from Greek through Arabic. They added the article in Arabic, al, and that gave alchemy.
English is full of words which came into the language from Arabic in this way. Many of them describe mathematical concepts which were completely new to Europe. Algorithms are named after an Arabic mathematician, and the concept of zero comes from the Arabic sifr, which means empty. It's where we get our word cipher from. But of course, the most obvious and lasting impact is the use of Arabic numerals. And in this Spanish Latin text, which dates from around about 986 AD, we have the first example of Arabic numerals written in Europe.